Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I'm back with another tutorial for Craftangles, and this time I thought of creating a quick, simple mixed media style layout. I was really inspired by the Wanderlust Elements pack and especially the hot air balloon and this clock, and they have earthy tones, sort of more vintagey, the browns, a little bit of the gold, ochre, and slight orange. So I decided that I would like to use those in my layout, and I've just fussy cut them out from the Elements pack. Apart from that, I would like to use these two stencils from Craftangles. This is the herringbone, and that brings in the element of the arrows, and this one is the honeycomb, brings about this abstract hexagonal pattern that I would really like on my background. So to match with my elements, I have a photo here, something again very abstract, meaning again dependent on each person's perspective. But here to me, it's about getting lost, the journey, reflection, things like that. Apart from that, I will be using some die cut elements to add as layers, and I have this All and Create die that I have die cut on some Craftangles cardstock, and I will just be using these as and when I begin working. So I also have the negatives, that's the numbers, as well as these mini hexagons from the die cut, which I think I would like to use. For my color, I want to go simple and use some distress oxides, and so I just have picked out shades here to go with my color palette, the vintage brown but a little orange tones here and there. So as I work, I will decide what color I need where. So from my stash, I here have this 12 by 12 piece of paper, and I like it because again it just matches the color palette that I have in mind but gives me good white space for my backdrop. If I was going to be using sprays and a whole lot of texture, then ordinarily, like I always do, I would prime my surface with gesso. But since I'm mostly focusing on using distress oxides and maybe a little bit of texture, I will not prime it and I will just begin working on my background directly. So first I'm going to use the spiced marmalade and walnut stain distress oxide inks with my honeycomb stencil, and what I actually am going to do is add the two inks on my stencil directly, very randomly just rubbing it across. And I can always clean my ink pad later. Gently with a wet wipe, so that removes any contamination. And I will quickly mist this with water, not too much. And use a dry paper napkin to get a little print. So I would like my photo somewhere down here, and so I want my stenciling around this. So that gives me a very subtle abstract design from the stencil here and a negative of the stencil, which, like I said, is very gentle but just begins to add that first layer of texture that I need for my background. So I still have color here and I can just further mist it. Now using the same stencil, but this time with my blending tool, I'm just going to add the two colors. So that will give me another effect from the same stencil, adding another layer of texture. So in that way, I have a little more texture down in place, and you can see how the same stencil works differently with a negative imprint and with the positive one. So I quite like that texture so far. And now with my second stencil, I'm going to use the vintage photo to add another brown and scattered straw to just bring in the sort of this aged linen color back into my background. And I will use it sideways to get my movement horizontally near my focal point. And I would also like to just bring in a little bit here on the top to balance my focal. So I'm just going to use the same stencils and add a little color. Now I've just cut a small piece of paper from the Craft Angles Vintage Rosette paper pack, just to give a nice layer for my photo, and that just makes everything pop out even more. And I'm just going to scrape the edges of this as well as my main page. So with my sides distressed and scrapped, what I've also done is just mounted my layout onto some chipboard, and that just gives it a nice firm steady base. Now I would like to distress the edges of my layout, and I always like to do two tones, and since it's the whole vintage feel, I am going to go back to my first two shades here, the Spice Marmalade and then Walnut Stain. So I'll first distress it with Spice Marmalade, and then I'll distress the edges with Walnut Stain, and that just adds in more depth and shadow. So for my Spice Marmalade, I'm actually going inwards out, starting inside and going out. So I have that color and a nice little border there. And with my Walnut Stain, I'm just focusing on the edges slightly inward, so then you can see how that double tone just brings in so much shadow. Time to add some background stamping, and I'm just going to use some assorted stamps for some random texture, and I'm going to be using black archival ink for this, but also just going in with a little vintage photo and maybe spiced marmalade. With that done, I have good layers, and I just want to add a little highlight, going back in with the same stencils, but this time I'm going to use the Craft Angles Rust Paste Orange as well as Brown to just highlight that color here and there lightly. going to use some Craftangles black gesso and color my die cut elements here, because I think it would be a good idea to add that darker contrast and bring these out with black. That's done. Now I can highlight my die cut elements, and I'm going to use the copper penny and gorgeous gold Craftangles wax here and gently use a paintbrush and rub these two colors on all my die cut elements to add the colors from the background, but then giving it a nice metallic touch yet subtle. So on the black against my background, all of these are going to pop really well. Now it's time to just work on my composition. So I've used layers of chipboard pieces here to mount my photo on the base page. So that just gives it more depth and dimension. And I just layer my die cut elements around the focal point and glue them all down in place. As I don't have too many elements, this is easy. It's just about working around the photo and adding these elements, so all my movement is horizontal from the left to the right, as well as a little on the top. I use the negatives, the numbers and the hexagon to stick them as though an outburst, or so that they look like they are just bursting out from the middle, from the center of my composition outwards, and just breaking free from there. Now time to add some splatter. So I go back with my orange and brown rust paste, but really add a lot of water and dilute them, and add splatter on top around my die cut elements and the mini composition, as well as around my main focal composition in between. And I have just added some sentiment phrases, mounted them again, glued them with chipboard, and I want to add some glitter. So I'm using this copper glass glitter and Craftangles soft gloss gel, just misting it with water so that I get a nice liquid glue, using a paintbrush to spread it around my composition and sprinkling the glitter. So that's a look at my completed layout, all the details, the close-ups. I'm very happy with my final product because, like I said, I was working on this idea of minimal elements, a nice simple background and a vintage layout. I do hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial, and do hit the thumbs up to let us know. Leave your comments because that always is a huge encouragement. Until the next time, take care and bye-bye.